In the archives of the former Holy Office in Rome, there was, for more than 40 years, a single sealed envelope that 4 popes handled and none chose to publish. Inside it, the handwriting of a Portuguese nun, recording what she said 3 children saw in a field in 1917. 2 parts of her account were published during World War II. The third was locked away, with a note on the envelope that it should not be opened before 1960. That year came and went in silence, and the silence did more than any prophecy could. It bred forgeries, Cold War theories, and a question that survived 4 papacies. In the year 2000, the Vatican finally published the text, 4 small handwritten pages, and a vision of a bishop dressed in white. For some readers, the file closed that day. For others, including Catholic journalists and churchmen, the questions had only begun. Tonight we read what was released, follow it along its long road to daylight, and mark carefully where documented history ends and speculation begins. The envelope is open now. What it held was quieter, darker, and harder to interpret than the rumors. Chapter 1. A Republic at War with its Priests. To understand why a story told by 3 shepherd children became a matter of state, you have to begin 7 years before they told it, in a country that had just decided it no longer wanted a king. Lisbon, October of 1910. Warships on the Tagus River turned their guns toward the royal palace. Rebel soldiers and armed civilians hold the high ground of the capital, and for 2 days the city smells of smoke and salt and gunpowder. When the fighting ends, King Manuel II, 20 years old, on the throne for only 2 years because his father and older brother had been shot down in the street in 1908, boards a yacht and sails into exile in England. He will never see Portugal again. A monarchy of nearly 8 centuries is gone in a single autumn week, and in its place stands the Portuguese Republic, young, broke, ambitious, and certain of its enemies. Of all those enemies, the Republic was most certain about one, the Catholic Church. To the men who now governed Portugal, most of them lawyers, journalists, and professors shaped by the anti-clerical currents running through Europe at the time, the Church was not simply a religion. It was the partner of the fallen monarchy, the owner of vast property, the educator of children they intended to educate differently, and the single greatest obstacle to the modern country they meant to build. They moved against it with remarkable speed. Within days of the revolution, the government expelled the Jesuits and dissolved the religious orders. Convents and monasteries were seized, their communities scattered. Then, in April of 1911, came the centerpiece, the law of separation of church and state, drafted under the direction of Afonso Costa, the Republic's most forceful anti-clerical politician. The law did far more than separate. It declared church buildings the property of the state. It banned religious instruction in schools. It regulated when bells could ring and when processions could walk the roads. Priests who accepted state pensions came under state oversight, and bishops who protested were, in several documented cases, driven out of their own dioceses. Costa is widely reported to have predicted that thanks to this law, Catholicism in Portugal would be eliminated within 2 generations. Historians still argue over his exact words and where he said them, so treat the quotation loosely. The law itself needs no such caution. The text is public, and it speaks plainly enough. The Vatican broke off diplomatic relations with Lisbon. The Portuguese countryside, deeply Catholic, in a way the cities were not, simmered and prayed and waited. Here is the first thing worth holding on to as this story unfolds. When the events at Fatima begin in 1917, Portugal is not a sleepy religious kingdom. It is a battlefield between a militantly secular government and a wounded, defensive church. Every claim of a miracle will be read by both sides as a move in that war. The government will see clerical manipulation. The church will see divine vindication. Neither side will be neutral. And that, strangely, helps anyone trying to reconstruct what happened, because it means the events were scrutinized from the very first week by people with every motive to tear them apart. Now add a second layer of suffering. The World War. Portugal entered the Great War on the side of the Allies in March of 1916, after seizing German ships in its harbours at Britain's request and receiving a German declaration of war in reply. By the spring of 1917, the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps was shipping out to the trenches of Flanders. That same spring, on the other side of the Atlantic, the United States was entering the war as well, and American troops were beginning the crossing to France. In other words, the months this story begins are the months the whole world is being pulled into one furnace. In Portugal, it meant that tens of thousands of young men from villages, exactly like the ones in this story, put on uniforms and disappeared north into the mud. In stone houses across the countryside, mothers now lived from letter to letter. Food prices climbed. Governments fell and rose in Lisbon at a pace that made the Republic look less like a new dawn and more like a fever. And in the background, unnoticed by almost everyone in Western Europe, that same year would bring revolution to Russia, a detail that will matter enormously later. For reasons no shepherd child in Portugal could possibly have known. That is the country. Now come to the place, about 75 miles north of Lisbon, in the dry limestone hills of the Serra de Air. In the district of Ourum sits a small parish called Fatima. The name itself is a relic of the Muslim centuries of Iberia, a Moorish woman's name attached by local legend to a princess who converted after the Christian reconquest. In 1917, it is a scatter of hamlets, stone houses, sheep pens, and thin fields fenced with piled rock. No electricity, no newspaper. Water comes from wells and cisterns. Life is the flock, the church calendar, and the rosary said in the evening, because that is what has always been done. In summer the hills bake pale and hard. In winter the wind comes across the uplands and finds every gap in the stone. In one of those hamlets, called Aljustrel, live 3 children. Lucia dos Santos is the youngest daughter of a farming family. Born in March of 1907, she is 10 years old in the spring of 1917. A sturdy, serious girl who has already made her first confession and who tends her family's sheep because her older sisters have aged into other work. Her cousins live down the same lane. Francisco Marto, born in 1908, a quiet boy who likes music and lizards and long silences. The kind of child who drifts to the edge of the group and watches. His sister Jacinta, born in 1910, the baby of the 3, affectionate, dramatic, stubborn, only 7 when this story begins. They pasture their flocks together in the hollows and hillsides around the village, including a broad natural bowl of land called the Cova da Iria, a name you will hear many times before this night is over. One more thing must be said about these children. and it must be said carefully, because it comes from a source written long after the fact. In her memoirs, composed in the 1930s and 40s at the request of her bishop, Lucia described events from 1916, the year before the famous apparitions. She wrote that on 3 occasions an angel appeared to the 3 children in the fields and rocky hollows near their homes, calling itself the Angel of Portugal, teaching them prayers of adoration and reparation, and telling them to prepare for what was coming. There is no contemporary record of these angel visits. No one wrote them down in 1916. By Lucia's own account, the children told almost no one at the time. So the honest position is simply this: the angel episodes exist only in Lucia's later testimony, and you may weigh that testimony as you see fit. They are part of the Fatima tradition. They are not part of the documented 1917 record. That distinction between what was written down at the time and what was written down years later is the sharpest tool we carry through this entire story. Pick it up now. Keep it close. In May of 1917, the documented record begins. It begins with a Sunday like any other. Mass in the morning in the parish church. The families in their dark best clothes. Then the 3 children driving their small flock out along the stone-walled lanes to the Cova area, a piece of land Lucia's family partly owned, to let the sheep graze while they ate their bread and cheese, played their games, and said their rosary in the abbreviated style of children who wanted the prayers finished and the games begun. By that evening, the youngest of them would break a promise of silence to her mother. Within a day, the story would be moving from kitchen to kitchen. Within a month, strangers would be walking the dirt roads toward that empty bowl of pasture, and within 6 months, tens of thousands of people, believers, skeptics, and newspaper reporters from the anti-clerical press of Lisbon would stand together in the rain in that same field, waiting to see whether the sky would keep an appointment made by 3 children. What the children said happened on that first Sunday is where the record opens. Chapter 2. 6 Sundays in the Cova. The 13th of May, 1917, was a Sunday. In the account Lucia gave to church investigators that same year, and repeated in its essentials for the rest of her long life. The day began with nothing more remarkable than sheep. The 3 children had driven their flock to the Cova area and eaten their lunch in the thin spring sunshine. Around midday, by their reckoning, they saw what they took to be a flash of lightning out of a clear sky. Fearing a storm, they began herding the animals downhill toward home. Then a second flash, and then, above a small home oak tree, hardly taller than the children themselves, they saw a figure. Lucia would later describe a lady dressed in white, more brilliant than the sun, holding a white rosary. The lady told the frightened children she came from heaven, asked them to return to the same place on the 13th day of each month for 6 months, and asked whether they were willing to offer themselves to God and accept whatever sufferings might come. The children said yes. Francisco, by every account including Lucia's, saw the figure but never heard her speak. Jacinta saw and heard. Only Lucia spoke with her. The asymmetry was there from the first day, and it never changed. Francisco saw but did not hear. Jacinta saw and heard. Lucia alone spoke. 3 witnesses, 3 different experiences of the same midday, recorded that way in the earliest testimony and held that way for 88 years. The children agreed among themselves to say nothing. Jacinta, 7 years old and glowing with the thing, lasted until sundown. She told her mother. By the next day, the story was in every kitchen in Aljustrel, and the reactions inside the two families set the pattern for everything that followed. Francisco and Jacinta's father, Manuel Marto, a calm and respected farmer, inclined to believe his children. Lucia's mother, Maria Rosa, did not. She was, by Lucia's own later account, ashamed and furious, convinced her daughter was lying before the whole parish, and she tried scolding, threats, a stick, and finally the parish priest to force a retraction. Lucia never retracted. Remember that the harshest early skeptic of Fatima was the visionary's own mother, in the visionary's own house. The first interrogations these children faced were conducted at home, and they were not gentle. On the 13th of June, the feast of Saint Anthony, when every child in the parish had a festival to attend and every reason to attend it, the three went back to the Cova instead. A few dozen villagers went with them, curious, doubtful, or both. The witnesses saw no lady. What several of them later described was the behavior of the children during the vision. The sudden stillness, Lucia speaking toward the tree as if in conversation, and small oddities of light and sound around the little oak that different witnesses reported differently. According to Lucia, the lady that day told her something that would mark the rest of her life. Francisco and Jacinta would be taken to heaven soon. Lucia would remain longer, because God wished to use her to spread devotion in the world. She was 10 years old, and by her account she had just been told she would outlive her two closest companions. Word moved along the footpaths of the district, and the crowd in July was in the low thousands. Farmers and townspeople standing in the summer heat around 3 children and a shrub. The 13th of July, 1917, is the hinge of this entire story, because, according to Lucia's later written testimony, that is the day the lady showed the 3 children a vision in 3 parts and told them to reveal it to no one. The secret of Fatima, the object of everything this account is tracing, dates by her word to that July afternoon. What the crowd around them saw was only this: 3 children staring at a tree, one of them going pale and crying out at something no one else could see. Here the sharp tool from the first chapter comes out again, and this time it is worth naming exactly where the early evidence lives, because a promise of documentation means nothing without an address. Everything just said about the content of that July vision comes from documents Lucia wrote more than 20 years later. What exists from the summer of 1917 itself is different in kind. The parish priest of Fatima, Father Manuel Marques Ferreira, interrogated Lucia within days of the early apparitions and wrote his notes down. Those notes, along with the earliest parish and diocesan papers, the depositions of villagers, and the newspaper coverage of that year, were gathered decades later into a critical edition published by the shrine itself, the Documentação Crítica de Fatima, which runs to many volumes and is the corpus serious researchers on every side of the argument actually work from. What those earliest documents contain is the essential frame: a lady, a request to return monthly, and, by midsummer, the children's insistence that they now held a secret they would tell to no one, not to the priest, not to their parents, not to anyone. The existence of a secret is documented in 1917. In ink, by a skeptical churchman. The content of the secret enters the written record only decades later. Those are 2 different kinds of fact, and you will be asked to hold both at once for the rest of the night. By August, the crowds had grown large enough to alarm the government in Lisbon and its officials in the district. The government acted. The administrator of the district of Urim was a man named Artur Santos, a committed Republican, a Freemason by most accounts, and no friend of shrines. On the 13th of August, the day of the promised fourth apparition, he intercepted the three children, offered to drive them to the Cova himself, and instead drove them to the district seat at Urim. He held them for roughly 2 days. He questioned them separately and together. He demanded the secret. When questioning failed, by the children's own accounts and the recollections of the Marto family, he locked them in the town jail among adult prisoners and told them they would be boiled in oil. Then he had them taken out one by one, so the two still waiting would believe the boiling had begun and the screaming was next door. Picture the cell for a moment. Whitewashed stone, a high barred window, the smell of men and damp straw, a 7-year-old girl crying for her mother, then drying her face and leading the prisoners in a rosary, with a religious medal hung on the wall for an altar, because that is what the accounts of that afternoon describe. A 9-year-old boy kneeling beside her, thieves and drunks kneeling too, some of them laughing at first and then not laughing, and a 10-year-old girl summoned alone down a corridor to be told her cousins were already dead. And would she like to save herself? None of them changed the story. None of them revealed the secret. Even hostile observers conceded afterward that whatever else was true at Fatima, the children either believed what they were saying or possessed a discipline under threat that no one had ever met in a child. The administrator gave up and sent them home. At the Cova that same day, a crowd of thousands had waited for children who never arrived, and many later claimed they saw unusual lights and colors in the sky anyway. The kidnapping, intended to smother the affair, multiplied it. The Republic had just handed the shrine its first martyrs, and they were 7, 9, and 10 years old. On the 19th of August, at a nearby pasture called Valinhos, Lucia reported that the lady appeared again and made the promise that set the stage for everything. In October, she would perform a miracle for all to see, so that everyone might believe. September 13th drew a crowd, most estimates place in the tens of thousands, filling the bowl of the Cova and the slopes around it, and then there was nothing left but October. A specific, public, falsifiable promise, made through the mouths of 3 peasant children, now had a date, an hour, and an audience gathering from across the country. Either something would happen in front of the largest crowd the district had ever seen, or nothing would, in front of the same crowd, with the newspapers watching. The rain began the night before. Chapter 3. The day the sun seemed to fall. It rained across central Portugal all night and into the morning of the 13th of October, 1917. The roads to Fatima filled anyway. They came on foot, by mule cart, by bicycle, some walking through the night from villages 20 and 30 miles away, barefoot pilgrims and city skeptics on the same mud tracks, farmers, fishwives, students, priests in plain clothes, and, crucially for history, reporters. The anti-clerical press of Lisbon had been covering the Fatima affair for months, mostly with mockery, and the papers sent correspondents to witness what they expected to be the collapse of the whole spectacle, a promised miracle, at a promised hour, on a promised day, is an ambush waiting to happen. If nothing occurred, The Republic's newspapers would feast for a year on the shepherd children and the credulous poor. How many people stood in the Cova area that day is genuinely uncertain, and it is better to say so than to pick a number. Contemporary estimates ranged from 30,000 to 70,000 and beyond, with figures around 50,000 the most commonly cited in the press of the time. Whatever the true count, the photographs taken that day survive, and they show a sea of black umbrellas and drenched wool covering the hillsides, one of the largest gatherings in rural Portuguese memory. Standing in standing water, waiting for noon. Around midday, by the sun, Lucia reported the lady's final apparition. She told the crowd to close their umbrellas. The rain, by many accounts, had begun to slacken. Then, according to a great many of the people present, though not all of them, something happened above their heads. The most quoted description did not come from a pilgrim. It came from Avelino de Almeida, editor-in-chief of O Século, the largest circulation newspaper in Lisbon. Secular, Republican, and the author of a mocking piece about the whole affair published that very morning. In his report 2 days later, Almeida described the clouds breaking and the sun appearing as a strange disk that could be looked at directly, spinning like a wheel of dull silver, casting shifting colored light across the faces and clothes of the crowd. He described the moment the crowd screamed, when to many thousands of eyes the disk seemed to tear loose and plunge toward the earth before returning to its place. He wrote as a journalist, reporting what he and the people around him experienced, and he left the question of miracle explicitly to others. When furious secular readers demanded a retraction in the days that followed, he wrote a second piece and stood by every line. He had seen what he had seen, whatever it was. Other testimony came from unexpected directions. Dr. José María de Almeida Garrett, a professor at the University of Coimbra, wrote a long and careful account of the rotating disk, the colored light, and the sensation of the sun detaching from the sky. Testimony often cited because it comes from a trained academic observer trying hard to be precise about something he could not explain. Devotional collections assembled in later years also include witnesses from outside the Cova itself, people miles away who had not joined the gathering and who reported unusual solar effects from their own villages. Those same later collections include repeated claims that rain-soaked clothing and the muddy ground seemed to dry with unusual speed. Those details come from testimony gathered by people sympathetic to the shrine, some of it years after the fact. So, hold them with the appropriate looseness. They belong to the witness tradition. They are not measurements. The complications run in both directions, and honesty requires all of them. Not everyone saw it. Some in the crowd reported nothing but glare and cloud, and no astronomical evidence indicates that the sun physically moved that day. A displacement of the kind the crowd described would not have been a local event over one Portuguese hillside. It would have been the end of the ordered sky, visible across half the planet, and nothing of the sort was recorded anywhere. So whatever tens of thousands of people experienced in the Cova, it cannot be treated as a literal movement of the sun itself. On that narrow point, believing scholars and skeptical scholars agree, and the Catholic tradition of interpretation has never required the sun to have left its place. The explanations divide from there, and you should hear the strongest form of each. The natural explanations point to a crowd staring toward a sun veiled and unveiled by breaking storm clouds, to retinal fatigue and after images documented to produce spinning and color effects. to unusual atmospheric optics through moisture-laden air, all amplified by expectation, exhaustion, months of anticipation, and the contagion of thousands of voices crying out at once. Every one of those mechanisms is real and has been observed elsewhere. The difficulty they face is the shape of the event, the range and rough agreement of so many reports, and the awkward fact that it occurred at the announced hour of a publicly predicted miracle. The religious explanation accepts a sign given to the crowd's perception. The difficulty it faces is the unevenness. Why a sign meant for all to believe was invisible to some who stood in the same mud with the same hopes. The surviving evidence cannot resolve that division. What it does establish is narrower and stranger than either camp usually admits. A specific miracle was promised months in advance, through 3 children, for a specific day and hour. On that day and hour, before tens of thousands of people, including hostile journalists, a mass experience occurred that the secular press itself reported in tones of shaken wonder. The photographs show the crowd, not the sky's behavior. The newspapers survive in the archives. Anyone can read them. Whatever it was, it lasted minutes and ended. The crowd came down off the hillsides, soaked and shaking, and scattered into the roads, and the legend began its work in every direction at once. But inside the story, the important thing had already happened quietly. Back in July, 3 children were carrying a secret through all of it. Through the crowds and the jail cell and the screaming sky, within 3 years, 2 of them would be dead. Chapter 4. 2 Graves Before the Secret. History has a way of following its miracles with plagues. In the autumn of 1918, as the Great War was ending, the influenza pandemic that people called the Spanish flu swept across Portugal, and it came up the limestone hills to Aljustral like weather. It took the Marto household almost entirely. At one point, nearly the whole family lay fevered in their beds at once, and it was the father, Manuel Marto, who stayed on his feet and nursed them room to room. Most of the family recovered. Francisco and Jacinta did not. According to Lucia's later memoirs, the 2 youngest seers had never expected to recover, because the lady had told them in June of 1917 that she would come for them soon. Whatever weight you give that account, written 2 decades afterward, the documented outline of the 2 illnesses is sad enough on its own, preserved in parish registers, hospital records, and the lifelong recollections of the people who watched. Francisco declined slowly through the winter. He was 10 years old. Those who visited him described a boy who did not fight the illness so much as keep it company, spending what strength he had on the prayers he said he owed. He had one request as the end approached, repeated to his family, that he be allowed to receive his first communion before he died. The parish priest came, heard the boy's confession, and gave him the sacrament at his bedside. He died the next day. The 4th of April, 1919, at home in Aljustral, and was buried in the small parish cemetery under a plain wooden cross. He had seen the lady 6 times, by his account, and Lucia's, he had never once heard her voice. Jacinta's road was longer, and it is one of the hardest stories in the whole Fatima record. The flu left her with an infection that settled in her chest and became purulent pleurisy. Fluid and infection pressing around the lung. She was 8, then 9. She was taken first to the hospital in the town of Vila Nova de Urem, where 2 months of treatment failed and left her thinner than before. She came home for a while, to the house, and the lane and the last of her childhood. Then, in the winter of 1920, the doctors recommended Lisbon. Consider what that journey meant. A 9-year-old from a hamlet with no electricity, who had spent her whole life within walking distance of one church bell, carried by train down the length of the country, away from her mother, to a capital city she had never seen, to be treated among strangers. The trip ran the better part of a day. The accounts say she watched the country go past from the window, the pine woods, the river, the tiled roofs of towns she would never learn the names of. In Lisbon, she was lodged first in an orphanage run by a woman remembered as Mother Godinho, who later wrote down the sayings of the grave, strange child in her care, and then admitted to the Dona Estefania Hospital. There, in February of 1920, surgeons operated on her chest. By the accounts preserved from the period, her condition was too weak for general anesthesia, and the operation proceeded with local anesthetic. 2 ribs were removed. The wound had to be dressed and drained in the days that followed, and the dressings, by those same accounts, caused her terrible pain. She endured it, reportedly repeating the offering the lady had asked of the children, to accept suffering for the conversion of sinners. 4 days before the end, she asked for the last sacraments. A priest came and heard her confession, but judged that communion could wait until morning. She told him she would not live until morning. She was right. Jacinta Marto died on the 20th of February, 1920, in the evening, in a hospital ward in Lisbon, 9 years old, with no family beside her. She was buried first in the vault of a benefactor's family at Vila Nova de Urim. In 1935, her remains were transferred toward Fatima, and when the coffin was opened for identification, witnesses, including church officials, reported that her face was recognizably preserved, a detail that entered the devotional literature immediately and has stayed there since. Photographs from the opening were sent to Lucia in her convent, and her written reply, preserved in the record, grieves for her small cousin in the plain language of family. Both children lie today inside the basilica that rose over the Cova da Iria. In 2017, a century after the apparitions, Pope Francis declared them saints, the youngest non-martyr children ever canonized by the Catholic Church. Now step back and look at what the 2 deaths did to the story itself, because this is a turning point that has nothing to do with theology and everything to do with evidence. In 1917, there were 3 witnesses. By February of 1920, there was 1. Every future question about Fatima, every interrogation, every memoir, every secret, now had a single door it could pass through. A girl not yet 13, who had buried the only 2 people on earth who had shared the strangest experience of her life, and who had been told, by the lady herself, according to her own account, that this was exactly how it would go. From this point forward, whatever Fatima was going to become would rest on the memory, the honesty, and the endurance of Lucia dos Santos alone. Her memory and her honesty are 2 different questions, and this account will keep them apart. But from 1920 on, everything runs through her. Church authorities increasingly concluded that leaving her at the center of the growing pilgrimage was a risk to the girl and to the devotion alike. Crowds were still coming to the Cova. The press was still hostile. Every pilgrim wanted to touch the surviving seer, and every reporter wanted to trip her. So, in the spring of 1921, quietly, almost secretly, The bishop arranged for her to be sent away to a church school in the north, her identity to be kept from the other students. She left Aljustrel before dawn, and the accounts of that morning say she stopped at the Cova in the dark to pray at the little tree one last time. She was 14 years old. She would never live in Fatima again. The field stayed behind, and the crowds kept coming to it. The secret left before sunrise, in the memory of one girl on a cart in the dark. Chapter 5. The nun who waited 20 years. The bishop who took charge of Lucia's life was José Alves Correa da Silva, first bishop of the restored Diocese of Leiria, and his strategy was simple: distance and discipline. Lucia was enrolled under a partly concealed identity at a school run by the Dorothean sisters in Porto, with instructions to tell no one who she was and to speak to no one about Fatima. In 1925, she entered the Dorothean order herself as a postulant and made her religious profession in 1928, living at the order's houses in Pontevedra and Tui, just across the Spanish border. Much later, in March of 1948, she transferred to a far stricter enclosure, the Carmelite convent of Saint Teresa in Coimbra, taking the name Sister Maria Lucia of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart. Behind those walls she would remain, with rare exceptions, until her death in 2005. While she prayed in Spain, the institution examined her story with a slowness that looks almost strange now. The diocese opened a formal canonical inquiry in 1922. It took testimony from witnesses of the events of 1917, weighed the newspaper record and the parish interrogations, and deliberated for 8 years. On the 13th of October, 1930, 13 years to the day after the crowd watched the sky, the Bishop of Leiria issued a pastoral letter declaring the visions of the children worthy of belief and formally authorizing devotion to Our Lady of Fatima. Notice the careful shape of that ruling. In Catholic practice, a judgment of that kind commands no one to believe anything, and it did not rest on the secret, which the bishop had never read, because in 1930 the secret had never been written down anywhere. It existed in one place in the world, behind the eyes of a Dorothean sister in Spain. It might have stayed there. What moved it onto paper was obedience, and the documents obedience produced are the center of everything that follows. Between 1935 and 1941, at the direct request of her bishop, Sister Lucia wrote 4 memoirs. The first, in 1935, was a portrait of Jacinta, prompted by the opening of her cousin's coffin and the photographs that reached the convent. The second, in 1937, told the story of Lucia's own life. And it was here, 21 years after the fact, that the angel apparitions of 1916 entered the written record for the first time. The third memoir, written in August of 1941, contained the sentence that changed the shape of Fatima forever. In it, Lucia revealed that the secret of July 1917 had 3 distinct parts, and she wrote out the first 2. The fourth memoir, finished that December, retold the whole story in fuller detail and repeated the 2 parts with 1 additional sentence at the end, a sentence about Portugal that readers would argue over for the next 80 years. The third part she declined to write at all, saying she was not yet permitted by heaven to reveal it. Before this account tells you what those first 2 parts contained, and the next chapter will stop and look hard at the dates. The most serious scholarly problem in the entire Fatima file lives right here, in plain sight, in the chronology, and it deserves to be stated without softening. The second part of the secret, as written in 1941, speaks of the end of the Great War. It warns that a worse war will break out in the reign of Pope Pius XI if humanity does not change. It points to a night illuminated by an unknown light as the great sign that the punishment is coming. It speaks of Russia spreading her errors through the world. Now set the dates beside each other honestly. Pius XI died on the 10th of February. 1939, the Second World War, by the standard reckoning of every general history in print, began with the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September, 1939, nearly 7 months after his death. Under his successor, on the plain reading of the prophecy against the plain reading of the calendar, it does not fit. Defenders of the text have an answer, and it is not invented after the fact. Sister Lucia herself gave it. She maintained that the war had actually begun with the German annexation of Austria in March of 1938, which fell squarely within the reign of Pius XI. That reading is not absurd. Historians do argue about when the Second World War truly starts, and some place its beginning in the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, years earlier still. But it is a reading that has to be chosen, and the choosing is done by the person defending the prophecy. The great sign has the same structure. A spectacular aurora turned the night skies of Europe blood red on the 25th of January, 1938, an event that made front pages across the continent and was explained by astronomers at the time as an unusually strong northern lights display. Lucia identified it as the promised sign. The identification was made afterward, by her, of an event that had already happened. And the Russian element runs the same way. The revolution of 1917 had long since grown into the Soviet Union by the time anything was published. So the chronological problem, stated cleanly, is this. Every checkable element of the second secret was written down after the event it describes had already occurred or begun. Catholic scholars have acknowledged this openly. It is not a skeptic's ambush. The two responses divide honestly. One side holds that Lucia faithfully recorded in 1941 what she had heard in 1917 and had carried privately for decades, and points to her correspondence with her confessor around 1940, in which, by the reports of those who have studied the letters, she refers to elements of the secret before the later confirmations. The other side holds that memory is not a sealed envelope. 24 years of hindsight, spiritual reading, convent life, and world catastrophe can shape what a person sincerely remembers, with no intention to deceive anywhere in the process. A person can be perfectly honest and imperfectly accurate. The gap between those two words is where this entire argument lives, and the documents alone cannot close it. What the documents do show, beyond any dispute, is this. By the end of 1941, 2/3 of the Secret of Fatima was on paper and moving toward the public, where it would be printed, translated, preached, and argued over while a world war burned. 1/3 existed nowhere on earth except in the memory of a single nun in wartime Portugal, who said the time to write it had not yet come. What changed her mind was not curiosity, and not pressure from Rome. It was an illness, and an order she could not refuse. Chapter 6. The First Two Secrets. Here is what Sister Lucia wrote in 1941, when her bishop asked for everything she could give. And here is what the world gradually learned as those texts began to circulate. The secret of July 1917, she explained, was a single experience in 3 parts. The first part was a vision. According to her account, the lady opened her hands, and the light streaming from them seemed to penetrate the earth. And the 3 children saw what Lucia called a sea of fire. In that fire they saw demons, and human souls, like transparent burning embers, lifted into the air and falling back on every side amid shrieks and groans of pain and despair. It lasted, she wrote, only a moment. And she added that the children would have died of fright if they had not been promised beforehand that they would be taken to heaven. The lady then told them they had seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go, and that God wished to establish in the world devotion to her Immaculate Heart in order to save such souls. Notice what this first part is and what it is not. It is not a prophecy. It contains no dates, no nation, no popes. It is a piece of classical Catholic teaching, the reality of hell, delivered as a single overwhelming image to 3 small children. One detail from the contemporary record sits beside it curiously. Witnesses in 1917, including the skeptical parish priest, recorded that the children had turned to startling penances that summer, giving their lunches to other children and to sheep, going thirsty through the August heat, wearing knotted ropes against their skin until the adults found out and intervened. That behavior was documented at the time. The vision said to explain it was written down 24 years later. Consistent, a defender says. Constructed to fit, a skeptic answers. Both possibilities stay on the table. The second part is where history enters, and it deserves close and faithful paraphrase of the published text. The war is going to end, the lady said, speaking of the war then raging. But if people do not cease offending God, a worse one will break out in the reign of Pius XI. When you see a night illuminated by an unknown light, know that it is the great sign given you by God that he is about to punish the world. To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart, and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she will be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. The 4th memoir adds one more sentence at the end of this section, and few sentences in modern religious history have carried more argument per word. In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. There the passage breaks off, followed by the Latin abbreviation, etc. Some commentators have read that dangling sentence as an implied contrast. If the faith would always be preserved in Portugal, then somewhere else it would not be. And the unwritten third part must therefore concern a crisis of faith inside the Church itself. Others answer that this is a cathedral of speculation built on a comma. Keep the sentence in mind. It comes back with consequences. Now, what happened with the requests? The requests had conditions, and conditions invite scorekeeping, which is exactly what the following decades produced. The story can be told through 4 dates. In 1925, at Pontevedra, Lucia reported a further apparition establishing the 5 first Saturdays devotion. In 1929, at Tui, She reported the formal request that the Pope, in union with all the bishops of the world, consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart. Two specific conditions: a named country and the participation of the world's bishops. The first date is 1942. Pius XII, in the middle of the war, consecrated the entire world to the Immaculate Heart, with Russia present only by illusion. Lucia later indicated the act was received in heaven but incomplete, because it was not the act requested. The second is 1952, when the same Pope consecrated the peoples of Russia explicitly, but without the world's bishops. Incomplete again, by the same standard. The third is 1984, John Paul II, before the statue of Our Lady of Fatima, brought from the Cova to St. Peter's Square. In a ceremony, every bishop on earth had been invited to join from his own diocese, entrusted and consecrated the world, with language pointing toward the peoples awaiting consecration, but without naming Russia aloud. Traditionalist critics spent years insisting the conditions had still not been met. The Fatima Shrine and the Vatican maintained that Sister Lucia herself, in letters from 1989 onward, confirmed that heaven had accepted the act. Critics of that confirmation questioned the letters and the filters they passed through. The convent and the Vatican stood by them. The fourth date arrived long after everyone assumed the argument belonged to history. March of 2022. Weeks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Pope Francis, explicitly invoking Fatima, consecrated Russia and Ukraine by name to the Immaculate Heart, in union with the bishops of the world. Whatever one believes about heaven, the sight of a sentence spoken in a Portuguese pasture in 1917, shaping the wording of a papal act during a European war a century later, tells you how deep this story runs. One more honest accounting before the envelope, because the second secret invites it. Readers have long pointed out that Russia will be converted did not visibly occur on any schedule anyone can name. That the promised period of peace is hard to locate anywhere in the 20th century, and that prophecies conditional on human response can never strictly be disproved. Since any failure can be assigned to the conditions, defenders answer that the collapse of Soviet communism in 1989 and 1991, without the Third World War 2 generations had braced for, was precisely the kind of quiet astonishment the promise described. Both readings are on the table, and the choice between them belongs to you, not to a narrator. By 1943, the Church had a more urgent problem than interpretation. Two parts of the secret were circulating in print. The third existed in exactly one place: the memory of one woman, and that woman was seriously ill. Chapter 7. The Envelope. In the middle of 1943, Sister Lucia fell gravely sick. Pleurisy, the same family of illness that had taken Jacinta, followed by an infection after a medical procedure. She was 36 years old. In Ladia, her bishop faced a possibility that made the matter suddenly urgent. The third part of the secret of Fatima could die, not be suppressed, not be leaked, simply cease to exist, the way a language dies with its last speaker. In September of 1943, visiting her sickbed, the bishop suggested she write the third part down. Lucia hesitated. She had said for years that she did not feel authorized by heaven to reveal it, and a suggestion was only a suggestion. So, in the middle of October, the bishop removed the ambiguity and made it a formal command. An order in writing, under religious obedience, to commit the third part of the secret to paper. For anyone outside the Catholic tradition, That phrase needs unpacking, because the whole scene turns on it. A vowed nun promises obedience to her superiors as part of her consecration. An order given that way is not workplace instruction to be weighed against her own judgment. In her framework, it is understood as the will of God reaching her through the ordinary human structure of the Church. Refusing it was not an option she considered available. What happened next is one of the strangest episodes in the entire file, and it rests on Lucia's own testimony, given in letters at the time and in interviews decades later. Weigh it as testimony. She could not do it. For more than 2 months, by her account, every attempt failed. She described sitting at her small table in the convent at Tui with pen and paper, ready, willing, commanded, and being unable to form the words. A paralysis she had never experienced with any other writing. A psychologist might find much to say about a devout woman ordered to produce the most dreaded document in her world. Her own explanation was different. The block lifted, she said, on the 2nd of January, 1944, when the lady appeared to her in the convent chapel and confirmed that writing it was the will of God. On the 3rd of January, 1944, by the account preserved in her convent's records, Sister Lucia wrote the third part of The Secret of Fatima, then sealed the finished text in an envelope. Every stage of that scene, the chapel, the confirmation, the date, comes to us through her and through the convent. There were no other witnesses in the room. There never were. In this story, from the first day at the Cova onward, on the envelope she wrote an instruction, and more argument would eventually hang on that instruction than on anything inside. By express order of Our Lady, the envelope could not be opened before 1960, and then only by the Cardinal Patriarch of Lisbon or the Bishop of Leiria. Why 1960? In later years, officials and visitors asked her directly, and the answer reported consistently by those who questioned her was almost disappointing in its modesty. Because by then it will be clearer. In no documented statement did she claim that something was scheduled to happen in 1960. She indicated only that the text would be better understood by then. Remember that answer. Half the mythology of the next 2 chapters grows in the space where people ignored it. The sealed envelope reached the Bishop of Leiria in June of 1944, carried by an intermediary bishop rather than trusted to the post. Then, for 13 years, almost nothing happened, which is itself among the strangest facts in the story. The Bishop of Leiria, the one man on earth entitled to open the envelope before 1960, chose never to read it. By the recollections of those around him, he wrapped Lucia's envelope inside a larger envelope of his own, sealed that too, and kept the package first in his desk and then in the diocesan safe. He reportedly offered it to Rome more than once. Rome, under Pius XII, declined to hurry, which tells you something about how the Vatican of that era ranked the file. The Holy Office finally requested the document in 1957, reportedly as part of a general request for copies of all of Lucia's writings for the archives. In the spring of that year, the envelope traveled from Leiria to the Apostolic Nunciature in Lisbon, and from there to Rome, into the keeping of the Holy Office. The department that had once been called the Inquisition, where exactly it rested in Rome, would become, incredibly, a disputed question in its own right. Accounts published by Vatican officials in 2000 describe it in the archive of the Holy Office. The secretary of a later pope would describe a text kept much closer to the papal apartments, in a small writing desk, Both accounts may describe the same paper at different moments, or a copy, or a detail misremembered across 50 years. Keep the discrepancy in mind. Small as furniture. In this story, furniture will matter. Pius XII, so far as any published record shows, never opened the envelope. He died in October of 1958, and the cardinals elected a successor whom nearly everyone described as a caretaker. Around Varm, 76-year-old Venetian named Angelo Roncalli, who took the name John the 23rd. The deadline written on the envelope in a nun's careful hand was now barely a year away, and the whole Catholic world knew it. Priests preached on 1960. Devotional magazines counted toward it. In Portugal, pilgrims spoke of the year the way other nations spoke of elections. In August of 1959, at the papal summer residence, an official of the Holy Office arrived carrying a small package for the new pope. Inside it, 15 years old and still sealed, was the handwriting of the shepherd girl from Aljustral. What the old man did after reading it was nothing. What the world did with that nothing was everything. Chapter 8. The popes who read it and said nothing. Castel Gandolfo, the papal summer residence in the hills above a volcanic lake south of Rome. August of 1959. Pope John the 23rd receives, from the hands of an official of the Holy Office, the envelope that has been waiting 15 years. What follows is documented better than almost any other private moment in this story, because the man who carried the Pope's daily life in his briefcase, his personal secretary Loris Capovilla, lived to be over 100 years old and described it in interviews and written answers for the rest of his days. By Capovilla's account, the Pope did not tear the envelope open in hunger. He set it aside and waited some days. When he did read it, the Portuguese gave him trouble, and he called in the Vatican's Portuguese translator to be certain of the wording. Over the following period, he showed the text to a small circle. Officials of the Holy Office, members of his household, and then, according to the note Capovilla said, was placed with the document itself. Pope John dictated his decision. He would make no judgment on it. He would leave that to others, to his successors. The envelope went back into the dark, which meant that 1960, the year written on the seal in a nun's careful hand, the year half the Catholic world had been counting toward, arrived carrying nothing at all. It is worth pausing on what kind of year that was, because the mood of the moment shaped how the silence landed. 1960 was the year an American spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory and its pilot paraded on Moscow television. The year a summit in Paris collapsed in fury. The year Americans watched two young candidates argue on live television about missile gaps and the survival of the West. School children in Ohio were practicing what to do when the siren sounded. In that atmosphere, a Portuguese nun's sealed envelope with a date written on it was not a devotional curiosity. To a great many people, it looked like a timer. In February of 1960, an unsigned statement was released through the Portuguese press agency, attributed only to Vatican circles. It announced that the Third Secret of Fatima would most likely remain under seal forever. The reasons offered were dry to the point of coldness. The Church did not wish to take responsibility for guaranteeing the truth of the words. Although she recognized the Fatima apparitions, she did not desire to give a private revelation that kind of official weight. No name was attached. No press conference was held. After 43 years of apparitions, crowds, memoirs, and a countdown printed on an envelope, The answer from Rome was an anonymous paragraph telling the world, in effect, to go home. Here is an editorial judgment, offered as one. That paragraph was among the costliest communication decisions the modern Vatican ever made. Silence from an institution is rarely received as emptiness. It tends to be received as confirmation that something is being withheld. If the secret was ordinary, people reasoned, why bury it? If it could not be printed, what could possibly make it unprintable? Into that vacuum, over the following years, poured everything the Cold War imagination could produce. The secret foretold nuclear war. The secret named the date of the end of the world. The secret predicted Russia victorious over the West. And in the version that proved most durable of all, the secret was not about the world, but about the Church itself. Apostasy at the very top, and the popes were hiding it because they were its subject. Then, in October of 1963, the speculation acquired a text. A German periodical called Neues Europa published what it presented as an extract of the Third Secret, supposedly obtained through diplomatic channels. It was apocalypse by the yard. Cardinals against cardinals. Bishops against bishops. Fire from the sky. Millions dead in a single hour. Rome destroyed. A great war before the century's end. The document was a fabrication, and it is worth saying plainly how that is known. When the Vatican published the authentic manuscript in the year 2000, the two texts could be laid side by side, and they share essentially nothing. The forgery is several times longer, different in voice, different in structure, different in content from the first line to the last. Yet for 37 years, the Neues Europa text circulated through books, pamphlets, and sermons as the real thing. And one of its phrases, cardinals opposing cardinals, echoed so persistently that senior churchmen were still being asked about it decades later, as if it was scripture. Ali, given a head start of decades, does not surrender its territory just because the truth finally arrives. This story met that principle once already, in the hills of Portugal. It will meet it again before the night is over. The genuine envelope, meanwhile, stayed in its archive, and the popes kept their habit of silence. Paul VI, elected in 1963, read the text on the 27th of March, 1965. According to the account, the Vatican itself later published and returned it without comment. 2 years after that, he did something no pope had ever done. He went to Fatima in person, on the 50th anniversary of the apparitions, and stood before a crowd reported at more than 500,000 people. Sister Lucia was brought to the platform to meet him. A small figure in a dark habit among the vestments and the cameras. She was 60 years old and had not stood in that field in front of the world since she was a child. Accounts from those close by describe her asking for a private audience, and not receiving one. The Pope spoke of peace, blessed the crowd, and said nothing whatsoever about the secret. To most observers that day, the message seemed unmistakable. Fatima, yes, embraced before the world. The envelope, no. In 1978 came a pope who reigned 33 days. John Paul I had, as a cardinal, once visited Sister Lucia at her convent in Coimbra, and published accounts differ on whether he ever read the Third Secret during his brief pontificate. That door stays ajar. When he died suddenly in September of 1978, The conspiratorial imagination folded his death into the Fatima legend within weeks, without a single document to feed on. Legends by then no longer needed feeding. His successor was a 58-year-old Polish cardinal, Karol Wojtyla, John Paul II, a man from the far side of the Iron Curtain, from a nation that had lived for 3 decades inside the very phrase the Second Secret used. Russia will spread her errors. He knew the Fatima devotion well. Yet, by the Vatican's own published account, even he did not immediately ask for the envelope. It stayed where it was. Through the first years of his papacy, through the rise of the Solidarity movement in Poland, through the gathering anger of the Soviet bloc, he asked for it in the summer of 1981. By then he had been shot. Chapter 9. May 13th, 1981. St. Peter's Square, Rome. The 13th of May, 1981, a Wednesday afternoon. The weekly general audience. 20,000 people in the spring light. The white open jeep moves at walking pace through the corridors of the crowd. The Pope has just handed back a little girl he lifted for a blessing. The time is a few minutes past 5. 2 shots. Then more. The exact count varying among accounts. A Browning 9mm pistol, fired across the barrier at close range. The Pope buckles into the arms of his secretary. 1 bullet has passed through his abdomen, perforating the intestine in several places and missing the main abdominal artery by a margin his surgeons would later describe in millimeters. Another round strikes his hand and arm, and 2 women in the crowd are wounded, both of whom survive. The jeep accelerates. An ambulance runs the streets of Rome. And at the Gemelli Hospital, the Pope undergoes more than 5 hours of surgery and receives transfusions amounting to much of his blood volume. He lives. The gunman does not escape the square. He is seized in the crowd by a nun and bystanders, among others. A detail the newspapers of the world could not resist. He is a 23-year-old Turkish national named Mehmet Ali Agca, an escaped convicted murderer already sentenced in his absence for killing a Turkish journalist, connected to a violent ultra-nationalist network known as the Grey Wolves, who, if anyone, sent him became one of the great unresolved espionage questions of the century. Italian investigators pursued a Bulgarian connection, and behind Bulgaria, the shadow of Soviet intelligence. On the cold logic that the Polish Pope's support for solidarity threatened the entire Eastern Bloc, trials were held. The alleged Bulgarian accomplices were not convicted. To this day, no one has proven who stood behind Agca, or that anyone did, and nothing in this account will pretend otherwise. What no investigation has ever disputed is the date, the 13th of May, 64 years to the day after 3 children in a Portuguese pasture first reported a lady brighter than the sun. There is no evidence Agca chose the date for that reason or knew what it was. The coincidence was noticed by everyone else on earth, and by one man above all, in the Gemelli Hospital. Through a long summer of recovery and a second hospitalization for infection, John Paul II turned his mind to Fatima. By the Vatican's published account, in July of 1981, he asked for the documents concerning the 3rd part of the secret, and they were brought to him in the hospital. The original Portuguese and an Italian translation, lying in a hospital bed with a bullet wound in his abdomen. He read, at last, the 4 handwritten pages his predecessors had left sealed. What he found there, the world now knows from the text published 2 decades later, a vision of a bishop dressed in white, making his painful way through a half-ruined city full of the dead, praying for their souls as he went. And at the top of a mountain, beneath a great cross, that bishop killed by a group of soldiers firing bullets and arrows. A bishop in white, shot. The Pope's conclusion was not ambiguous, and he repeated it publicly for the rest of his life. One hand fired the bullet, he said, and another guided it. He came to believe, and said so at Fatima itself, that the Lady of the Message had deflected the shot that should have killed him. You may hold any view you wish of that interpretation, and serious people hold several, but consider the position of the reader. A man with a fresh bullet wound, reading a vision of a shot bishop in white, on the anniversary of the vision's own origin. In the city, the vision seems to sketch. He was never going to read that page as a stranger. No one alive could have. A year later, on the 13th of May, 1982, he stood in the Cova de Iria to give thanks, before a crowd in the hundreds of thousands. That day produced its own strange, half-forgotten postscript. A Spanish priest, ordained in a breakaway traditionalist movement and convinced the Vatican was suppressing the true faith and the true secret, broke through toward the Pope with a bayonet and was wrestled down at close quarters. Reports at the time said the Pope was untouched. Decades later, his longtime secretary stated publicly that the blade had in fact reached him and drawn blood, a wound concealed at the time. Even the attacks at Fatima, it turned out, had secrets. In 1984, the bullet recovered from the floor of the Jeep, preserved through the investigations, was sent by the Pope to the Bishop of Leiria. It was set into the golden crown of the statue of Our Lady of Fatima, the same statue that had stood in St. Peter's Square for the consecration that spring. Those who placed it described the bullet fitting a space beneath the orb of the crown, so exactly that it seemed the crown had been made waiting for it. That description comes from devotional memory, and you may season it to taste. The bullet, at any rate, is there. Pilgrims file past it today. Agga himself, in his Italian prison, learned about Fatima and became obsessed with it. At his trial, he shouted that he was announcing the end of the world. He demanded the Third Secret be published, insisting it concerned him. When the Pope visited his cell in December of 1983, in one of the most photographed acts of forgiveness of the century, the two men spoke quietly in a corner for 20 minutes. What was said between them remains private, but by multiple accounts of the visit, the prisoner's urgent question was not about pardon. It was about the secret of Fatima. And what it said. The man who fired the gun had become one more theorist in the crowd. The envelope went back to the archive. Here is the strangest turn in its whole biography. The Pope, who now believed its vision had been fulfilled in his own body, chose, for 19 more years, to keep it sealed. The explanation the Vatican eventually gave, that the vision could only be read in peace once the century of its subject matter had closed and the Soviet world had fallen, is coherent, and it is the official one. Whether other considerations weighed alongside it is not documented, and this account will not invent them. What can be observed is only the arithmetic of those 19 years. The theories of 1960 did not die in them. They grew libraries. Chapter 10, June 26, 2000. The decision to open the envelope was announced, fittingly, at Fatima itself. The 13th of May, 2000, John Paul II, nearly 80 now, slowed and bent by Parkinson's disease, had come to the Cova de Iria to declare Francisco and Jacinta Marto blessed. The final step before sainthood. In the front rows sat a small figure in a Carmelite habit, 93 years old, brought from her convent for the day. Sister Lucia, in the field where it all began, watching her cousins raised toward the altars, 80 years after she had watched them buried. At the end of the Mass, the Vatican's Secretary of State, Cardinal Angelo Sodano, stepped to the microphone with an announcement almost no one in the crowd expected. The third part of the Secret of Fatima, he said, would be made public. He offered a preview in careful, lawyerly language. The vision concerned the persecution of the Church in the 20th century, and the bishop clothed in white who falls under gunfire appeared, above all, to describe the suffering of the popes, and in particular the assassination attempt of 1981, 6 weeks later, on the 26th of June, 2000, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith published a document titled The Message of Fatima. It contained a photographic reproduction of Sister Lucia's manuscript of January 1944, so that anyone could see the handwriting itself. The ruled paper, the careful convent script, a translation, an account of the envelope's journey through the archives, with dates. The 1944 text of the first 2 parts for comparison, and a long theological commentary by the congregation's prefect, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the man who 5 years later would become Pope Benedict XVI. After 56 years under seal, anyone with a newspaper could read the Third Secret of Fatima. Here is what the published text describes. In close and faithful paraphrase, Lucia opens by saying she writes in obedience to God, conveyed to her through the Bishop of Leiria and through the Mother of God. She then describes an angel standing to the left of Our Lady and slightly above her, holding a sword that burned. Flames came off the blade as though the world were about to be set alight. But the flames failed and went out wherever they met, the radiance streaming from the lady's right hand toward the angel, pointing down at the earth with his other hand. The angel called out one word 3 times, penance. What the children saw next, Lucia writes, came inside an immense light she identifies as God, and she reaches for a comparison a child of her village could make. It was like watching people go past in a mirror. In that light, she saw a bishop in white, and she records her impression rather than a certainty. They had the sense, she writes, that this was the Holy Father. Behind him and around him, other bishops, priests, monks and nuns were climbing a steep mountain. At the summit stood a large cross made of rough trunks with the bark still on them, the kind of corkwood she had grown up among. The way to that summit ran through a city, and the city was half destroyed. The Pope crossed it unsteadily, half trembling, weighed down by grief. Praying as he went for the dead whose bodies he passed, he reached the top. He knelt at the foot of the cross, and there a group of soldiers killed him, firing bullets and arrows, in the same manner, one after another. The bishops and priests and religious and lay people of every rank died as well. Beneath the 2 arms of the cross stood 2 angels holding crystal vessels, catching the blood of the martyrs as it fell and sprinkling it over the souls that were making their way toward God. That is the entire text. 4 small pages, no dates, no named nations, no nuclear fire, no destruction of Rome, no cardinals against cardinals, nothing whatsoever of the fabricated apocalypse that had circulated since 1963. a vision of a persecuted, climbing, dying church, rendered in the imagery of a Portuguese child's world, cork trees and mountains and soldiers, and, at its center, a pope who is shot. The commentary published alongside it mattered as much as the text, because it told the world how the Vatican itself proposed to read the thing. Ratzinger's argument, compressed but not distorted, ran like this. First, a private revelation, even an approved one, stands below Scripture, adds nothing essential to the faith, and binds no Catholic to believe it. Second, the vision speaks in symbolic language, the language of interior perception rendered in images, not a film of the future played in advance. The half-ruined city gathers into one picture the destinations of a century of violence. The mountain and the cross are history seen from the height of its martyrs. Third, and most consequentially, Ratzinger wrote that the events to which the third part of the secret refers now seem to belong to the past. The vision, in this official reading, was about the 20th century, the century of the world wars and the totalitarian persecution of believers, culminating in the attempt on the Pope's life. Insofar as individual events are indicated, he wrote, they belong to a history now behind us. He closed on the image he judged to be the heart of the whole message. The burning sword is met by the radiance from the lady's hand, and goes out. The future is not fixed. Prayer and penance change what is coming, which he noted is the exact opposite of fatalism, and the reason the vision ends in blood that waters souls rather than blood that merely falls. Alongside all of this, the Vatican published one more document, and its author is a name to remember, Archbishop Tarcisio Bertone, then Secretary of the Congregation, described a visit he had made that April to the convent in Coimbra. Accompanied by the local bishop, he had brought the manuscript pages and placed them before Sister Lucia. By Bertone's account of the meeting, she confirmed the handwriting as her own, confirmed the text as the one she wrote in January of 1944, and confirmed that with this publication the third secret had been given in full. Asked about the meaning of 1960, Bertone reported her answering, as she always had, that the date was her own choice, because she felt the text would be better understood by then, and not because anything was appointed to happen. Notice the structure of what you have just heard. Every one of those confirmations reaches the world through the account of the official who conducted the interview. That is not an accusation. It is a description of the shape of the evidence. On the face of it, the file was now closed. The manuscript was photographed for the world. The last surviving seer had confirmed it complete. The reigning pope believed he had lived it. The Church's chief doctrinal officer had filed the whole matter, gently but firmly, under the past. The questions began within weeks. They did not come from the tabloids. Chapter 11. The fourth secret question. What followed the publication of 2000 became the most persistent dispute in the entire Fatima file, and it deserves to be laid out the way a careful clerk would lay it out, claim by claim, with the weight of each piece marked honestly on the box. Begin with what the doubters noticed in the text itself. In the vision as published, the lady never speaks. Not one word. Yet the first two parts of the secret are dense with her words. Warnings, requests, promises. And the fourth memoir had ended its transcription of the second part with that unfinished sentence. In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, followed by etc. and silence, where readers asked. Was the rest of that sentence? Had the lady explained the vision, as she explained everything else, in words written somewhere and published nowhere? The commentary of 2000 interpreted the vision at length. The dangling sentence it did not address. Next, the arithmetic of paper. And here every number must carry the name of whoever produced it. The manuscript photographed in 2000 is a folded sheet written on 4 small pages in continuous handwriting. Against that, the critics set descriptions left by churchmen who had handled the sealed envelope in earlier decades. Bishop João Venâncio of Leiria, successor to the bishop who first received it, was reported to have held the envelope up to a strong light, and to have described an inner sheet with wide margins, perhaps 24 lines of text. Cardinal Ottaviani, head of the Holy Office, who read the document in Rome, spoke publicly in the 1960s of a single sheet of paper. Advocates of the hidden text arithmetic count the published manuscript at around 60 lines and set that against Ottaviani's single sheet and Venanzio's 24 lines, and argue the numbers cannot be reconciled. Defenders answer that a man peering at an opaque envelope against a lamp is not taking a measurement, that a folded sheet can reasonably be called a sheet, and that recollections offered years apart are not affidavits. Every figure in this paragraph originates with a participant in the argument, not with a neutral inspection, and none of them should be repeated as though it were. Then, the geography of furniture, promised earlier in this story. The publication of 2000 located the envelope's Roman decades in the archive of the Holy Office. But Archbishop Loris Capovilla, the secretary of John XXIII, stated across his long retirement that the text his pope read in 1959 was kept afterward, not in that archive, but in a small writing desk, called the Barbarigo desk, in the papal apartment itself, and he referred to an envelope bearing his own handwritten annotations. An Italian researcher named Solideo Paolini, who corresponded with and visited the aged archbishop while investigating precisely this question, reported that when he asked whether there were, in effect, 2 envelopes, Capovilla's reply amounted to yes, precisely so. That report is Paolini's, published in support of a book arguing for a hidden text, and Capovilla elsewhere gave interviews consistent with the official account of a single secret. He died in 2016 at 100 years old, courteous to the end, having spent his last decades receiving researchers in a small house in the hills near Bergamo, answering letters in a careful hand, and never signing anything that settled it. Stop here, because this is the point where the whole dispute is most often misstated, and getting it right matters more than any single testimony. 2 envelopes would not, by itself, mean 2 secrets. An inner envelope inside an outer one, an original resealed by a bishop who wrapped it in his own cover, which is exactly what the Bishop of Leiria is described as doing. A text kept in the apartment and a copy in the archive. Any of these ordinary clerical arrangements produces 2 envelopes containing 1 manuscript. The hypothesis of a hidden text requires evidence that the contents differed, and that evidence, a second document, a witness who read different words, a photograph of another page, has never surfaced. Not once. In a quarter-century of motivated searching by people who would dearly like to find it, the dispute found its best-known advocate in 2006, Antonio Socci, a prominent Italian Catholic journalist, published The Fourth Secret of Fatima, in which he assembled the pieces you have just heard. The silent lady, the counted lines, the Capovilla Material, and added older testimony. Among it, a disputed interview Sister Lucia was said to have given in December of 1957 to a Mexican priest named Agustin Fuentes, in which she was reported speaking in urgent tones about a coming crisis of faith. The Diocese of Coimbra publicly repudiated the circulated version of that interview as embellished, and its reliability is argued to this day. Socchi also pointed to a remark Cardinal Ratzinger made in a 1984 magazine interview, that the secret concerned dangers threatening the faith and the life of the Christian, and therefore the world, dangers threatening the faith. Socchi argued, describes apostasy, not a repetition of 1981. The reply came from the highest level short of the Pope himself, and it arrived in a form no one expected. May of 2007, an Italian television studio. Late evening. The current affairs program Porta, a Porta, which is where Italy takes its arguments when they have grown too large for the newspapers. Under the lights sat Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, now Secretary of State, the second most powerful man in the Vatican, the man who had sat across from Sister Lucia in Coimbra. On the desk in front of him, brought out of the archive for the cameras, lay the envelopes and the manuscript itself. Viewers saw the yellowed paper, the careful convent handwriting, the wax and the seals, and a nun's instruction about a year that had come and gone half a century before. It was an act of transparency, almost without precedent for a Vatican official, and Bertone had already published his own book that year, recounting his meetings with Lucia in 2000, 2001, and 2003, and her confirmations, as he reported them, that everything had been published and nothing remained. The broadcast did not end the argument. It fed it. Attentive viewers noted that the envelopes on the desk included ones bearing annotations matching Capovilla's descriptions, and Socchi published an open letter asking why. If the matter was settled, the specific questions, the unfinished sentence, to the second envelope, the counted lines, had never been answered one by one. On the record, in order. There the matter essentially stands, and the balance should be stated plainly. Both pans of the scale, no document proving a hidden text has ever appeared. The only living witness confirmed the publication complete. Every time she was asked, through the officials who asked her, Benedict XVI, whose 1984 remark The Theorist's Prize said as Pope at Fatima in 2010 that anyone who thought the prophetic mission of Fatima was concluded deceived himself. Words some heard as an opening, though a message's continuing relevance is a different claim from a text's incompleteness. And he did not say the second thing. In 2016, when a German professor claimed the retired Benedict had privately admitted a hidden portion, the 89-year-old issued a statement through the Vatican press office calling the claim pure invention, absolutely untrue. Against all of this, the hypothesis survives on inference, measured margins, remembered furniture, and etc. Its advocates answer that every one of its questions could have been closed decades ago by a single act of total transparency, an independent examination of the archive, and that the act has never come. A story that began with 3 children keeping a secret from a parish priest had become, by the 21st century, an argument about whether the largest institution on earth was keeping a secret about the secret. And through all of it, in a convent in Coimbra, the one person who had written every word of every text in question was still alive. still praying the same hours, and still, as she had been since 1917, mostly silent. Her silence has its own history. It is the last thread left to follow. Chapter 12. The Silence of Sister Lucia. Across everything this account has traced, one fact has been hiding in plain sight. The woman, at the center of the most discussed private revelation of the 20th century, spent most of a century not speaking in public. Some of that silence belonged to the life she chose. A Carmelite enclosure is silence by design, and Lucia asked for that enclosure, petitioning for years before she was allowed to transfer to Coimbra in 1948. Some of it belonged to the ordinary discipline of religious life, under which a nun publishes nothing and receives no visitors without permission from her superiors. And some of it was particular to her, accounts across the decades, from would-be interviewers, from Fatima researchers, and from church officials themselves, describe an arrangement under which conversations with Sister Lucia about the apparitions required authorization from the Holy Office. Later renamed the congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. A rule of that kind is not a gag in the criminal sense. It is a filter, but a filter placed on the sole living witness of a disputed mystery is a serious instrument, and both her defenders and her critics agree it existed. What they dispute is its purpose. The institution's explanation was protection of an aging contemplative from the world's cameras, of a devotion from a personality cult, of a vocation from becoming a career. The critic's explanation was message control. The arrangement itself is well attested. Its motive is not documented, and a motive that is not documented should not be narrated as though it were. Picture the setting where the exceptions happened, because it explains a great deal about the nature of the evidence in this story. A Carmelite parlor is a small room divided by a grille, a lattice of iron between the world and the enclosure. Visitors sit on one side. The nun sits on the other. There is a table, a crucifix, a window, and very little else. Almost every consequential conversation about the secret of Fatima after 1948 took place in a room like that, between a woman who could not leave and an official who had come from Rome. No recording device, no transcript published at the time. The record of those meetings is the record the visitor chose to write afterward. What reached the public through that filter, over 60 years, was substantial, but always mediated. The memoirs of the 30s and 40s, written under orders. 2 further memoir texts in 1989, portraits of her father and her mother. Gentler documents from a gentler assignment. A book of spiritual reflections, calls from the Message of Fatima, composed in her later years and published in $2,000, in which she answered the questions pilgrims sent her. In general terms, about prayer and sacrifice and the meaning of the message. Interviews were rare, and the consequential ones were conducted by officials. Above all, the visits of Bertone in 2000, 2001, and 2003. Independent scholars, including Catholic historians with no taste for conspiracy. You have pointed out the structural weakness this created, and it should be stated exactly. Many of the late confirmations, most often cited in the disputes, that the publication was complete, that the consecration was accepted, that 1960 meant nothing in itself, reached the world through officials of the institution whose account was in question. That is not evidence of deception. Mediated testimony is still testimony. But a historian weighs testimony differently when every channel runs through one interested party. And so should you. Set against that weakness is something the critics have never fully answered. Her constancy, interrogated by her mother with a stick, by a government administrator with threats of boiling oil, by canonical tribunals, bishops, and cardinals, across 88 years. The basic frame of her account never changed. 3 children, a lady, 6 months, a secret in 3 parts. The theological detail expanded enormously over time. The angel, the vision of hell, Russia, the devotions, the first Saturdays, and that expansion is exactly where honest doubt does its work. Because a frame that holds while its contents grow is what both truthful memory and slowly elaborated memory would look like from outside. Even many of her critics distinguish carefully between deliberate deception, which almost none of them allege, and the quieter ways that devotion, obedience, hindsight, and half a century of reflection may have shaped what she sincerely remembered. The woman herself, by every account of those who met her in old age, was no haunted mystic. Visitors describe a brisk, humorous, practical Portuguese countrywoman who made rosaries, followed the news, worried aloud about the souls of politicians, and complained cheerfully about her failing eyes. On one of Bertone's last visits, when she was 96, she gave him her walking stick to carry back to Rome as a gift for the Pope, who by then could barely stand. She lived to see the century her visions were said to describe come to its end, and then to see the vision itself printed in the newspapers of the world. Sister Maria Lucia of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart died in her cell at the Coimbra Carmel on the 13th of February, 2005, at 97 years old. Her funeral was held 2 days later in the Cathedral of Coimbra, and Cardinal Bertone came from Rome to preside as the personal envoy of John Paul II. Carrying a message from the Pope that was read aloud to the congregation, the cathedral could not hold the crowds. People stood in the square and the adjoining streets, and when the small coffin was carried out to return to the convent cemetery, they waved white handkerchiefs and sang, which is how Portugal says goodbye. And the calendar produced one last, almost unbearable symmetry. The man who had sent that message, the bishop in white of her manuscript as he understood it, was dying in Rome that same winter, past speech, breathing with difficulty. 7 weeks later, on the 2nd of April, 2005, he followed her. The 2 lives that a bullet had bound together in 1981 ended 50 days apart. In February of 2006, her body was moved to the Basilica at Fatima and laid beside Jacinta. Across the nave from Francisco, the 3 shepherds of Aljustral, separated by 85 years, now lie a few steps from one another, a short walk from where the little tree once stood. One process remains open. In 2008, the Vatican waived the customary 5-year waiting period and allowed her cause for sainthood to begin. The diocesan phase gathered testimony and documents filling more than 15,000 pages, including a study of some 10,000 of her letters. In June of 2023, Pope Francis approved the decree recognizing her heroic virtues, giving her the title Venerable. The next step, beatification, requires a miracle attributed to her intercession, examined and approved. And as of the making of this account, that examination continues. The process weighs her holiness, her virtue, her life. It is not designed to settle, and will not settle. The historical questions traced here tonight, those belong to a different tribunal. The slow one, with no vestments and no closing date. Chapter 13. What the envelope still holds. The envelope itself is empty now. Its contents are photographed, published, translated into every major language, available to anyone on earth in less than a minute. And yet the argument did not end, which tells you the real container was never paper. So let this final chapter keep the promise made at the beginning, and sort everything the envelope held into 3 piles, by the only standard that has kept the night honest. The first pile, the contemporary and institutional record. It is larger than people think. The anti-clerical laws of the Republic and the war that framed the events. In statute books and archives. The parish priests' interrogations from 1917, the depositions of villagers, and the newspaper coverage of that year, gathered into the critical edition published by the Shrine. The kidnapping by the administrator of Urim, the crowd of the 13th of October and the accounts of the Sun, printed in the hostile Lisbon press within 72 hours. Beside photographs of the drenched multitude, the deaths of Francisco in 1919 and Jacinta in 1920. In registers and hospital records, the canonical inquiry and the bishop's ruling of 1930, Lucia's memoirs of 1935 to 1941, as physical documents with dates, the manuscript of January 1944 and its journey, Leiria, Lisbon, Rome, 1957, the anonymous statement of 1960, the forged secret of 1963, exposed by simple comparison in 2000, the shooting of the 13th of May, 1981, in every archive of the age, and the bullet in the crown at Fatima, the publication of the 26th of June, 2000, manuscript photographs included. These things are fixed. No serious participant in any of the disputes denies them. The second pile, later testimony. Here stands everything that reaches us through one memory, or through officials reporting one memory. The angel of 1916, every word the lady ever spoke, in every part of the secret, the vision of hell, the prophecy of the war and of Russia, written after the war had begun, the chapel confirmation of January 1944, the meaning of 1960, the completeness of the publication, confirmed by Lucia as Bertoni reported it. None of this is contemporaneous documentation of the events it describes. All of it is testimony, recorded later, most of it mediated. Testimony is not nothing. Courts convict on it and historians build on it, but its weight depends on the witness. And this witness presents the strangest profile in modern religious history. On honesty, she survived every hostile interrogation a state and a family could devise. At an age when children break in minutes, and never wavered across 88 years. On accuracy, her account grew richer with every decade of hindsight. Under obedience, inside an institution with interests of its own. Honest and accurate are different words. The entire scholarly argument about Fatima lives in the space between them. The third pile, inference and speculation, the Cold War apocalypses, the burning Rome of the forged text, the hidden second document, resting on counted lines, remembered furniture, a silent lady, and an unfinished sentence about Portugal. The claims about what popes feared and why they waited. Some of this pile is reckless, and some of it is careful. And the careful parts have earned real answers rather than scorn. because they ask questions the official record left open when it could have closed them. But after a quarter-century, the pile remains what it was on the day of publication. Inference. Not one document in it. Now the editorial conclusion this account owes you, stated as a judgment and nothing more. The history of the Third Secret of Fatima is, more than anything else, a history of what silence does. A bishop who kept the envelope 13 years and never opened it. A pope who read it and left the verdict to his successors. An anonymous paragraph in 1960 where an explanation should have stood. Decades in a drawer while a forgery fed the hungry. Even the transparency of the year 2000. Real as it was. Photographs and all. Arrived so late that a rival legend was already grown. Armored, and impossible to disprove. And the officials who finally spoke found that a truth delayed 40 years is received as merely another version of events. At almost every fork in this long story, an institution chose discretion. And at almost every fork, the vacuum filled with something darker than what the envelope actually held. The real text, when it finally came, was a prayer about martyrdom. The imagined text had been the end of the world. The distance between those two things was not created by heaven, or by Moscow, or by 3 children in a field. It was manufactured, year by year, by the waiting itself. Perhaps that is what the envelope still holds. Now that it holds nothing, a lesson about silence that outlived its own secret. In the Cova area tonight, the great square is quiet. The little home oak is long gone, carried off leaf by leaf and twig by twig by the pilgrims of a century ago. And a column of marble marks the place where the children said the lady stood. In the chapel built on that spot, a statue wears a golden crown, and inside the crown sits a bullet fired in Rome on a May afternoon. 3 tombs rest in the basilica nearby, 2 of them small. One that waited 85 years to join them, and somewhere in the archives of the former Holy Office, a few sheets of convent paper lie flat in the dark. Read now. Photographed, translated, spent. You have heard everything they contain, and everything the record can verify about how they got there, and where the verified record gives way to memory, and where memory gives way to guesswork. The line between those territories is the truest thing this story has to offer. Beyond that line, there is no document left to open.